Okay, I think we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Caravan. My name is Ishan Sharma, and today we'll talk about an interesting topic: widowhood debates in colonial India, reformist, nationalist, and the feminist in perspective. But before introducing my speaker and also talking a little about the lecture today, I would like to take a moment to talk about the platform. So if you're new on Caravan, please subscribe to it. We are also going to start a podcast, going to explore the podcast format as well uh, in a in some time. We are also seeking support, financial support from our viewers, our audience to support and sustain Caravan because we really do need it to continue our work. Caravan started in 2019 as a student collective, but we really do need some support to continue this work of promoting academic history to the general public on their mobile screens, through our YouTube lectures, through our various offline events, and many more formats that we wish to explore to, to promote history. So I'll put the Cato link, the crowdfunding link in the uh, on YouTube live chat. So please do consider subscribing. You can also become a member of Carvan through the YouTube channel. You can join Carvan through the YouTube channel to support, and also you can send the paid super chats on YouTube to support. So we look forward to your support. We will be very grateful. So about today's session, widowhood debates in colonial India, reformist, nationalist, and the feminist in perspective. The lecture tracks down some important aspects of debates on how widow remarriage and inheritance as the social legal arguments unfolded in colonial India. Question of the war widows is included to show variation in status of the widow with the coming of the empire's wars. The speaker conceptualizes three useful frames: reformist, nationalist, and the feminist, primarily to highlight the erasure of the widows in India and its resolution. Although the nationalist perceptions of widow status, reform, and her prowess and usefulness to the society seem to challenge the erasure and invisibility from which the widows suffered at that time. And the nationalist incorporation of widows during the colonial period was very complex, that we'll kind of we'll try to unfold today in the conversation. And this lecture revisits nationalist resolution of gender question in the light of widows own perceptions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, uh, Dr. Jyoti Atwal, and she is currently a professor, I think, and an associate professor at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU. And she engages with issues pertaining to Indian women in the reformist, nationalist, and the contemporary perspectives, socio cultural and religious aspects of women's lives in colonial and post colonial India, women's agenda and the nation, autobiographies of women and narratives of the personal and the political domains, politics of representation of gender relations in colonial India, Dalit and women's history. So thank you so much, Dr. Atwal, for accepting my invitation. And you were suffering from COVID. I hope you are feeling better. So thank you so much for delivering. This is I think your first lecture after the COVID stint for a few few weeks. So over to you, ma'am. You can now unmute yourself.
Am I audible? All right. Um, First of all, I'd really like to thank Mr. Ishan Sharma, who is host and developer of this very wonderful Caravan program, which is a wonderful program platform for all the scholars to share their views, and especially in the pandemic time, this was very useful. And I had been following and listening to some very prestigious speakers' lectures. So I myself very honored today that I'm on this platform speaking to so many on the YouTube, and it will be recorded and put there. So I'll get across my ideas to so many people. So thank you so much, Ishan, for this opportunity. And share my slides with you. There's some of the technical issues. Just 1 minute. Um, so pardon me for the technical delay. Ishan, there seems to be some problem with that slide we had set. So is it okay if I just share that and
Yeah, you can share a
because
PowerPoint.
there's some issue with that.
No
So
worries.
I'm really, really sorry for that. Yeah. Um, okay. Now are my slides visible? The
Yeah.
slideshow is visible? Okay. So I really apologize for this mode in which I'm presenting, but there's really nothing that I can do about it. It's my computer, which is set up like that, and is not set up for the. So I'm really apologize for that. Um, so I'll be sharing some of my thoughts today with you, some of my research, which has developed over the past 10, 12 years on the issue of widowhood and related issues. Uh, so we know that a lot of these issues of gender, a lot of these issues of oppression, domination, and exploitation are taken up or are well researched by the field of gender studies or women's studies. However, and some of the examples are, uh, some well-known sociologists, Wadley, Jeffries, and Pauline Colonial, and so on. And Prem Chaudhary could also be is a wonderful example of a historian and a sociologist. So we have seen that these are works which highlight some kind of exploitation. However, uh, I will not be talking about exploitation and domination. I will be talking about widowhood and erasure, which essentially means which means invisibility and absence from the public space. So my presentation is focused on politics of erasure of widows and how historically reformers, nationalists, and widows themselves or women's groups sought to address that. Uh, this is a very interesting picture you see here. Everybody can identify with Sholay, and there's one. The movie is so full of music, action, etc. And it was a blockbuster of all times. However, we remember it also for this image of the widow played by Jaya Bhatt. And every time she comes onto the screen, there is some feeling that there cannot be something more than just a platonic relationship between she and somebody else. She has been visibly, in a way, erased, while the other protagonist, the female protagonist in the movie, well, there are all kinds of holy songs, and there's merrymaking and flirting, there's romance, there's singing. But for her, she's always seen as stern, self-controlled, and very much uh, uh, full of desire, but a very muted desire. And also, her love, therefore, has to be platonic. It could not be consummated. So this is something which we all identify with 1975 Sholay. So the study of widowhood, this particular study which I'm talking about, it looks at these techniques of making them invisible. And I use a term which I will in a minute come to. I use a term called living sati I use it to replace it with erasure. And the reason I use living sati as a term is because it is against the term dying sati. So in the reformist language, uh, while sati of course mean chaste and pure, and it does not really mean the practice itself or the ritual itself that we identified. It's more than that. So a living sati is identified with the rules and codes and norms of how she's supposed to live. So the public visibility of the scholarship on widowhood has come about particularly in the study of widows in pilgrimage, Banaras, Vrindavan, and other places. And usually, the moment we talk about scholarship on widows, we identify these widows in the pilgrim spots in India. And also, the widows and the war are another category of widows who are where we don't have much literature on them. We don't have much scholarship on them. We really need that scholarship, and that's the point I will be finishing with uh, at the end. Um, and also, the widow at home. After all, what is the domestic labor? How is she? What are her rights? What are her relationships with her parents-in-law, her other relatives after the husband is gone? How does that fit? And some study has been done on that. And widows and work, of course, that after the husband leaves, of course, the nature of her work changes. Her life changes and everything changes for her. So scholarship has engaged with these issues so far. Um, uh, my take is somewhat a bit different. Um, and we know that we go back to 19th century for this, some of the most interesting issues that came up. And we call it the long 19th century, as you all know, because so many things happened in that. To begin with, the century began with the Sati Act and then ended with a very nationalistic turn and ended with the Age of Consent Act being passed. And uh, it ended, 19th century also ended with some sort of notion that this issue, the women's issue, could not be resolved via the control of caste, via the leadership of religion, or simply via the leadership of caste, by reforming castes or instituting reforms within certain groups in the caste or religious groups. There was more to it, that legal structure had to step in. And this is something very interesting about 19th century India. So widowhood in India was tied up with two different issues. One was sati on one side, out of which it had grown. The problem of widowhood had somehow become visible with the passage of the Sati Act. And then on the other side, it led to the Age of Consent Act, which means the widowhood issue could not be resolved without resolving the age of marriage of the girls. That is something which was very clear by the 19th century. This is a takeaway from the 19th century, that this question of widowhood was intertwined. Uh, Out of the three categories of women, sati, widow, and the child bride, uh, widows dominate the sociologists and the economist scholarship even till today. And at this point, by the 2001 census, we had 34 million widows, and by 2011, it had grown almost by 1 million. So they form about formidable percentage, which is 7% of the total female population in India. So these are not objects of reform from the past who we can simply locate in the past, but these are women and sections of women who exist and who continue to also multiply. But very surprisingly, there is also the age factor, which is very important, that in India, widows form about 1% of all women between the age of 15 and 35. So although it is small, but in India, because the numbers are very huge, there is a remarkable difference in the way reform and policies are conceptualized. So 12% of all women between the age of 35 to 59 were widows, and 55% of women above the age of 60 formed this particular chunk of widows. So it's quite a interesting distribution, although more than 55% were older, and it would seem like, well, it's a problem which concerns, probably lodging them in the old age and disease and medical attention to them, lodging, etc. But it's not such a simple question. The question is multiplied by several factors. We also find many young widows, middle widows, and we have very little information about what happened because it's so difficult to interview them. So whenever one goes for research to one of these pilgrim spots, very difficult to frankly sit down with any widow and get any sort of account uh, unless as a researcher. So it has been very difficult for me as well. So almost 30,000 widows were there in 2001 below the age of 15. So this is quite a huge number. And these are the numbers which are tabulated. We may have left out so many who are not tabulated. So I look at the whole issue of widowhood in three frames, as has been mentioned by Sean: the Reformist, Nationalist, and the Feminist. So, what is the Reformist? I begin with the Reformist. With the abolition of the sati in 1828, it was very clear that now the second stage would be how to take care of these widows who have, obviously we are not trying to suggest that that all women were sati or became sati and they became widow. We are not implying that, but we are implying in terms of act, there was a certain presumption that there will be an increase in the number of widows who will have to be dealt with in several ways. And this was not the first time that these widows were being noticed just because the sati was abolished. So widows became more noticeable. There was a direct linkage, but there was also a very interesting issue of child murder in different provinces. In the 1830s, some cases of child murder came to notice, and that is when we see the courts getting very active around how and why, who were these people, who were these women who were murdering their children, a very young, almost an infanticide, they're committing an infanticide, how and why. And it was found that many of these women were widows. So there was a direct connection that was found by the colonial courts between widowhood and child murder. However, but before finding a solution of widow remarriage or instituting a big policy decision on this, it was compulsory that the initiative came from a an indigenous agency. Not to say that the British were waiting for that, but when it came, they thought it was the right moment to take it. And although it was not, there was no general consensus on it on 1856 on widow remarriage bill. There was no consensus on it. In fact, people who voted against the passage were more in number. There were 50,000 signatures and only 5,000 signatures in favor of its passage. So we can see that even when there was no consensus, it was passed. And there were several reasons given for it. And, I won't go into the legislative debates, although they're very interesting, but we move on to other aspects. So it was however, the law was a permissive law. It only permitted the widow to remarry. It did not punish anybody who did not allow her to remarry. And in 1856, it was very, one couldn't conceptualize a widow walking into a court, coming up to the police and saying, in-laws are not permitting me to remarry, or my parents are not permitting me to remarry. So that permissive aspect of it was literally non-operative in this case. However, what is more interesting is the inheritance debate, adoption debate, forfeiture, which was a very important aspect of this particular act, was a very controversial and unresolved, remained unresolved till the 1937 Act was passed, uh, which resolved the whole matter. So till from 1856 to 1937, the cases in the court kept coming, and the widows were, the widows or their families were actually battling in the court for hold of property, mobile or immobile, or for adoption. So we see the act opens up a Pandora box of things. Uh, I have tackled some of these cases in my book, which I will tell you about. So the campaign became very popular, as we are all aware. Vidyasagar became a hero, and he wrote this tract first in Bengali, then he translated it to English for the purpose of circulation in the in the court, in the legal council. And then the result was that after the bill was passed, after it became an act, it became the Vidyasagar became an icon uh, in northern India. And of course, I'm sure there are other examples from other parts of India, but at least from the northern part of India, we have examples of individual reformers who actually wanted to know about what was there in that Vidyasagar's book that he had written. How had he argued in favor of widow remarriage? That is something which they wanted to know. And the book, which they ordered the book, which was in Bengali. And one such person who was very interesting, who I found out about, was Shankar Lal. He was from Bijnor, and he was an editor of a journal called Ablahit Karak. Ablahit Karak was launched in early 1900 and was completely devoted to remarriage of widows. Of course, there were caste boundaries which were drawn, religious boundaries for sure, but also caste boundaries were kept intact while he. But the overarching idea was to not let the widows suffer, and he himself had become a widower, and he slept on the floor for one entire year. He had one meal a day, and he behaved like a widow. So it's very interesting how this whole idea of pain and suffering translated into some kind of feminism, even amongst men. I'm calling it feminism, which is open to all kinds of questions, of course, for the 19th century. But I would still like to give it some name. So the book, while it was in Bengali, he learned Bengali, and he was able to ultimately read that. At least he says so. He was able to read that. Not too sure, but it is what I found interesting was the enthusiasm that he had imbibed and his commitment to the cause. So reform was very popular. This widow remarriage campaign. One broad idea which I would like to present is that there is a notion. There's on the one hand there was Vidyasagar, on the other there was Harbilas Sharda, very important person for widows' rights. We can call him reformer, legislator. He had many hats, and the foremost, he was one of those persons who had actually floated a bill in 1927 on to give Hindu widows the property rights. Um, you might ask, well, there is the Hindu widow, this is limited by the Hindu, it's only limited to the Hindu widows reform. Yes, it was limited to that, but the generation of debate was not limited. The generation of debate, the generation of reformist ideas, the notion of having a debate or this was between Sanatan Dharmis and between the Arya Samajis was a very popular method of resolving any issue that emerged out of, whether there should be remarriage or not, was almost becoming a popular public sphere debate after 1856, because a Widow Remarriage Act had been passed and many people did not agree to it. And so it was bound to uh, provoke a lot of dissent. And this dissent came out mostly in the forms of reinterpretation of the Shastras. But what Harpila Sharda did in roughly towards 1928, 29 onwards, he floats bills which do not have any basis in any religious texts or any interpretation of the text. And he just said, well, because the condition of the widows is not good within the households, I think we need to give them some share of property rather than simply say, simply lay out their terms and conditions of remarriage. Suppose they don't want to remarry, then what? Then what would happen? Or they do want to remarry. Why should she forfeit any property? And if she wants to remain within the marital, within the widowed household of the deceased husband, would why would she not get the amount or the equal amount of share that would accrue to her if he had not died? So these were the questions that were being framed by 1937, and 1937 the Hindu Women's Property Act was passed on the basis of the 1933 debate that had happened. So I'll just introduce to some aspects of it which are interesting. Then I'll move on to some other issues of nationalism. Some of the reinterpretation of the Shastras was very interesting. One was the notion of the Kali Yuga, which was taken from the Samhitas and Shastras, but they were not. But she was. But Vidyasagar was very keen that there should be a passage that he should extract and find out as to how, in the past, in the ancient texts, it was permitted for the widow to remarry. That was the sole intention with which he worked. There's been some debate about the fact that Vidyasagar was a Bhadralok, he belonged to a certain class and so on. I'm not going into that debate because that steers us away from this entire debate. But there have been some complicated, there have been some very interesting works on Vidyasagar himself. Brian Hatcher also is presented with some very fascinating ideas on Vidyasagar. So Kali Yuga was a period when the widow was unable to control or observe the brahmacharya that she was expected to. So it is the problem of the yuga, not widow. So the Kali Yuga can be blamed for this, and now we need to find solutions. So Parasara Samhita had some answers. So that's how he took this particular Shastric interpretation. The other was very interesting, which I found really interesting, was the time and the weight issue. That how many years he found a certain passage in Narada's Samhita, and he brought it to the legal council. This was the very interesting point that he was making. It spelled out the number of years the women from different castes should wait before remarrying. So the mention of remarriage was there. A Brahmin woman could wait 8 years for her absent lord and 4 years only if she is childless. So there are several arrangements and flexibilities that were available within the Shastras according to Vidyasagar. And this is why he is, I don't think this was a simple act of only based on only on saying that I will find an evidence. I think it is the spirit behind the evidence finding that matters here. And last of all, it was the Shudra woman for whom no period is mentioned, for which she is to wait for her husband. Coincidentally, while I was looking at the Sati debate, I also found some evidence of similar nature, that when the British were investigating the sati as to what is legal sati and what is illegal sati, which has been so well documented by Latamani and others, I have done some of the work from which covers northwestern provinces, um, and some of the cases of child sati in my book. The idea that Shudra women are not supposed to be sati, it's a ritual which they cannot be. It purifies people, it purifies women, and therefore it was some privilege that was to come to them, and they were free to therefore not perform it. Interesting, but of course there are various ways of looking at this very complex issue of of um, permissibility in the ancient period, in the ancient texts. Okay, now there has been some work on property rights of the widows. Come back. This has been the hotbed of all work that has been done. Lucy Carroll has looked at some of the cases in the high courts that had come up, and how Hindu Widows Remarriage Act was being worked into it. I have further expanded her work, her excellent pioneering work, and I have also looked at some of the cases of adoption where there were two widows, a man left behind. What would you do? There was the Daya Bhaga Mitakshara, how it was applied to different parts. Um, also the issue of conversion, and so many other issues were taken up together. Um, okay. The other problem which surfaced with the 1856 Act was this. I'm sorry, I'm going on about 1856 Act, but this was debated huge in the post 1860 period, and there were many cases which come up, and therefore I have to go back to this again and again, because that is an answer, that is a problem and an answer to so many things as to how they're to be understood in the late 19th century. Um, Now, this act was used by 1890s to deny, by many Hindu families, to deny widows such rights on remarriage, even when the customary law permitted it. Now, very interestingly, customary law was a law which was, which did not depend on Dayabhaga or Mitakshara, which basically meant the widows could remarry, but she had to marry or remarry her kin, her the husband's kin. In normally, she would be allowed to marry, or she rather would be forced to marry the brother, the younger brother of the deceased husband. And we have several terms that have been used there for that. It's not an ordinary marriage. It's called kareva, chadar charana, and other customs. And there are details of this in the ethnographic records of North India. So it was a very well established customary practice. And interestingly, when recruitment into the army took place from Punjab and Haryana, this became a problem. And when they were taken in, they had also to the British obviously could not implement this part of the act on those widows, because in case the soldier died, the wife was therefore allowed to hold on to the pension and also to remarry as a custom, the younger brother. So it was relaxed for the army men. It is very interesting, this whole aspect, and I wish there was some more work on this. Um, There was also the other issue of unchaste. Who was chaste and who was not chaste? Um, there was one ground on which was used by many households to deny property, and that was that widow therefore had probably slept with somebody. She had sullied the bed of her lord. This was the language that was used in the court, in the legislative council, saying, uh, because in case she develops a relationship with someone and probably shows becomes unchaste towards the bed of the dead husband, in that case all property should be revoked. Now there was a very arbitrary, there was a lot of arbitrariness into it as to how would one judge who were the people who would therefore check this. Would the courts responsible for this? Was the police responsible? Who would be held responsible? It was very difficult to say this. So while legal space brought some permissiveness, it also brought these problems of immediate need for forfeiture of property by the Hindu widow. So this was actually an act which was used by many of the relatives to debar their widows to debar of the property of the family, whether it was joint property or whether it was husband's property. And I won't go into the property systems again because it extend the okay. Um, Now, Harbila Sharda, uh, in 1929, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, that he had introduced a bill which was called the Hindu Widows' Right of Inheritance Bill. It was immediately shot down. It was immediately rejected. It was not even discussed because it was felt, the law members felt unanimously that there was no provision in tradition to give widows a share in the property cuts in any Hindu law of inheritance. So this was not considered as a bill even worthy of discussion, and it was said there was no basis for this. So Harbila Sharda, very interestingly, uh, there was of course consensus there should not be a same country. Um, there were other arguments which I thought were very interesting. Uh, One argument that was given uh, in order to contradict what Harbila Sharda was saying is in 1933 when he said right to maintenance. All right, not inheritance, but maintenance. At least give her some definite maintenance, some amount. Let's fix some amount. Now, the idea was that how would you fix? Because every family was different. The size of the family was very different. So it was very difficult to fix that. Now, the general consensus was that most of the household did take care of the widows. This was a general perception. But Harbila Sharda had done some groundwork and shown that he had many cases. He presented several cases where the Hindu widow was not given the due share, was not treated with respect, and was actually living a very frugal life, or very you know uh, or living in starvation in some places. Um, there was an argument against it. Several arguments were made, but one interesting thing which I liked was some of the conservative groups which opposed this bill had formed a distinction between Rajniti and Dharmani. And they were claiming that there was a certain way in which the Rajniti had to be done. When a foreign power sits on a different set of people, which is not their own, um, it has to basically listen. It has to follow their own dharmani. And they kept quoting from various various orders that the Queen had issued, proclamation the Queen had issued earlier, and other promises being made time and again by the British to not intervene in the practices, which were, ritualistic, which were, which went into the textual nature, interpretation of a certain kind. So there was a certain understanding that was developed within the Rajniti and Dharma. This is something very interesting, which I thought was okay. Um, this is the, I'm going to skip this. Now, another advocate from Mirzapur, this is based on some of my research that I did on United Provinces, and I found that some of the voices from United Provinces were also very much against giving the maintenance, because it was presumed that the maintenance was already being given. So there was no need to fix any amount. There was no need for the whole issue to be brought to the legal space. Um, so, so also this was felt that the Hindu widow obviously had to live a life of self-denial and austerity, and that what would she do with worldly surroundings, and why was there a need for a share of property? So these are some of the ideas of the many ideas that existed in the 19th century. We know that generally 19th century, there was churning, and there was, of course, the what we call colonial modernity, out of which there was a process that was set in motion, in which we see a lot of set contradictions. And it was also a time when reform was at its height. Various kinds of reforms were taking place within the Hindu community. And these reforms were embedded in the Shastras, but also they acquired certain modernity when they entered the courts. Okay. So some of the issues which we still face in the present day, which are which we inherit from the 19th century debate, is the inheritance rights are still being debated. Widows, the idea of economist Beena Agarwal, that widows should be therefore given, that daughters should be given the share in the property, and landed property, not just mobile property. This becomes a very interesting aspect of the present day, and comes out of this 19th century problems. Social stigmatization is one of the main issues that many widows face till today. Of course, public welfare policies are not very strong. Pensions are also not easy for the older lot, especially, to go and receive them. Prove that the husband died, and anytime, they also do not. Even if they're not in receipt of the pension, they have to work for uh, their living. And there have been some very good works which I read by sociologists, which are based on 500 household surveys, which were led by Jean Drèze and Martha Altrichen in 1994, and that was the last survey that was done, which had, which the findings were very interesting. So I have mentioned that in my book, and you can also, of course, read the book. Now, something interesting happened when in the early 20th century, the focus of the widows shifted from the focus of the reformist widows, widowhood, shifted to the idea of the nation, as to how to incorporate them into the nation. Now, we do know that the feminist discourse and the nationalist discourse all over the world, as has been developed by the West, uh, is problematic and complex. And Neera Yuval Davis has pointed out to the Gender and Nation in her book, has very clearly laid out that trajectory of how The two were intertwined, nationalism and feminism, and how they could not go together. Um, but we see some very interesting imageries, as you can see, um, some of the formulations. And this is a particular image, one of my favorites from my research work, uh, which I have on my book as well. This is 1930s image from a journal, from one of the books. I'm sorry, of the many books in the public space, in Hindi public space. And it's very interesting how Saraswati, instead of Veena, she's holding the charkha. So this would be a reformist and nationalist integration in some ways. Okay, so Gandhi, of course, when we look at the entry of Gandhi into the national movement, we do see his consolidation of women around the issue of nation, around campaigns, strikes, and making them more active in the public space. So the political training is very necessary, and that's where he brings in, he draws in women, widows as well. But in the process, he also says that, I'm not. He talks about purity, which is of course could do interpretation, and it is only very recently that we started looking at uh, the problematic of nation and gender. So prior to this, it was taken for granted that we would look at nation and gender would go together. And in India, particularly, the kind of the anti-colonial movement also shaped the anti-patriarchal movement. Yes, and to some extent, no, because it didn't lead to the desirous results. It did not give women the equality. But what it did is train them, train them politically. There was a certain language that women acquired, jail going, hunger striking. Those are very important training grounds for women. And we see them in 1930s. We see that so many, Geraldine Forbes in a book shows that widows, marginalized groups like Devdasis also contribute to the Gandhian movement because there's a mass appeal. There is also the charisma of Gandhi, which draws in these women, and they find that they're useful and purposeful. However, this being a kind of a meta narrative of widowhood and nation, I have also looked at some of the. I think what is very interesting is some of the feminist scholarship on this. How has it looked at it? So Meera Koshambi is in a very pioneering work on how women stepped out, and also Partha Chatterjee in the nationalist resolution of women's question and Gandhian movement have presented a critique of the Gandhian movement vis-a-vis the national question, and hinted at how it was not the resolution was never complete, but it was seemingly the Gandhian movement seemed to have solved and incorporated the women's issues. It it brought women outside the home. It brought women outside into the into other arenas. There was All India Women's Conference, which was very interesting and important, which actually suggested reforms for women, which also talked about the vocational training of women as teachers, as seamstresses, and also as cooks. So there was this, the agenda was, of course, quite diverse, and we still need to look at some of the, as to how the women were impacted, widows were impacted. So we have works of Geraldine Forbes, Radha Kumar, Padmana Gol. I've done some work on this. And so the work that has been done aims to say, asserts that this particular field of nation making trained women, but it did not complete the agenda. And many of them, and I have statements I have documents and statements, and I haven't mentioned them here, but I mentioned them in my book, and I will read out to you two or three of them, and then I'll wind up because I know I'm running short of time now. Okay. Now, what is very interesting is that there were some feminist assertions in the literary sphere. Now, when I say literary sphere, it's the Hindi literary sphere. Obviously, the early 20th century, as we know, brought uh, brought press and public together, and also brought women into this press. And women were writing, sometimes under anonymous name, sometimes anonymously, and sometimes these were men writing in the guise of women, and sometimes these were women writing boldly. So they're all varieties that we come across in the early 20th century. So, for example, in some of the novels and short stories, and we come across the idea that men are lustful. So this idea that men are lustful and women, while their desire, men's desire is lustful, but women's desire is pure. So that was another way of undoing the gender balance, the uh, reversing, sorry, the gender balance. And these are interesting ideas which come up. I can go back to some of the um, I can go back to some of the early 20th century texts, journals which critique the earlier reformists, and say that, why do you want to put us back in the institution of marriage? We don't want it. We don't. We want to be independent. We don't want a husband. Uh, and while your desire, because most of the men's desire is lustful and impure, but the women's desire is pure. So I think this particular understanding is interesting, and also the in many novels, including Premchand's novels, we come across, and I've come across, you know, uh, characters which don't really. Uh, sorry, is there a problem? We come across characters which are very contradictory, which we don't know whether it's a protest or is it a social articulation of a problem. But prostitutes come up as characters during this period, and this particular uh, am I audible? Am I audible, Ishan?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Something, okay. Thank you. Something was wrong with the right. So Rakhels, of course, or prostitutes or kept women become a category of women in these novels. Some of the texts also. And women do some autobiographical writing as well. There is quite a bold fictional mood at this point of time. And there are some novels which talk about how Rakhels were like Sadar Suhagins. They were always wedded. They would never become a widow. So Rakhels should not be underestimated. That was a very important point. And I think although this was a subversion, this was not accepted, uh, this was an absolutely bizarre explanation of how one would justify Rakhels. It was a way of protest. This was a literary protest that widows would articulate, that many of these widows would articulate, saying, do not put us back into the institution of marriage. And also widow homes, which were the natural homes, understood as natural homes for women, for abandoned widows and reformists and so on, were understood as sinful homes, or pap ashrams. It was addressed as pap ashrams. that there would be sin inside them, and they would not give any respectable living. They would not be provide. They would not provide any respectable living, and all these were like brotherhoods. And it's interesting how these feminist assertions were a critique of the existing institutions which had come up as reformist in the 19th century. So they discarded marriage, remarriage, and they also wanted to become teachers, nurses, and so on. So there was the Gandhian influence was very visible, but it was articulated in a very feminist position. I think most feminist position in amongst the women in India was taken up by the widows or the characters of the widows, which the authors were building around this time. And these characters obviously were built around the notion that they were readers for it. They were valid readers. Now, also there is from 1920s Three Darpan. There was Three Darpan. There was Chand, which was a very popular magazine and had write-ups on various subjects, not just women's issues. So the Sri Darpan in 1920, there was a writer. It was called Vidwaon Ka Apman, which would mean widows, insulting the widows. And there was a fury in it. The fury was that, I'm going to read this out. She says that these days men are busy asking for home rule, but have they ever taken a look at widows of the nation? So Desh becomes the idea that there's a Desh, there's a, uh, they won't call it Rashtra, this is called as Desh, because this territoriality is not very important at this point of time. It is the cultural sense of what a Desh is. The widow seems like a thorn to her parents. To the brothers, she seems like garbage. Many people hold the view that most widows are loose characters, and often they recommend that they widows ought to be treated harshly. They're absolutely wrong. None of them are like that. Let's say there are some. They can be educated and trained professionally and treated with love. So there is this articulation which is very interesting. And there are women who are also inviting other women to come, especially widows, to come and be teachers. And they say we provide full free training to widows, especially if they're widows, we provide free training. So there's a certain notion that this group has to be treated exceptionally differently. They're not like other women. Their exploitation is very complete. The other woman uh, the other woman who I thought was very important and was Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, and there is Tarabai Shinde as well. These two women, of course, both widowed, articulate their dissent from the existing reform, and she becomes, of course, a reformer herself and looks towards the West. While in Stri Purush Tulna, which has now been very nicely translated, and with a brilliant introduction by Rosalino Handlon into English, this is called Stri Purush Tulna, comparison between men and women. I think it's a must read for all the students of women's studies, of women's history of India. And it is not such a radical text, but it is again it questions the notion of equality as to why men would marry the next day, why women are not allowed to marry. So it longs for some kind of equality, although it is not asking for freedom to remarry. That is not it. It is asking for a certain equality to be established in some way. So there are these texts. I mean, there is a lot of feminist assertion, feminist is going on. Now, very briefly, I will rush through this. This is the idea of war widows, which I wanted to bring. There is some evidence of feminist association within the within the widows of the empire. Now, the first time we come across these widows, of course, are very important because but they are not like the other widows who have certain, who are embedded in some kind of intersectionality, which is inheritance, religious functions, religious identity, religious roles, etc. They are not intertwined with that. They are mostly bothered about how much pension the dead husband would get or not get, whether the pension is being given to the widow or not. And as you know, in the present day, this category of women is being multiplied by the wars that we are seeing these days, especially the Ukraine-Russia war, and we see war widows being created every day, orphans being created every day. So it is not something in the past. So what I came across, wanted to share with you. I have all this has been published after the book, so one can also see the full details there. Eva Marie Bell in 1919. She is wife of a major, and she writes uh, the Padda Wives of Indian Soldiers. This is a pamphlet, a big pamphlet, which she writes, where she articulates the rights of the Indian widows, particularly those she's familiar with. She's stationed in India and she develops a very strong bond with the Indian widows. And she argues for pensions for them, separation allowances and pensions for them, which were quite vague at that point of time. Even after the First World War, during the interwar period, the widows do not really they had to prove that the husband died. Sometimes the husbands had injuries. They came back with severe injuries from the war front and they died at home, which was not a duty period or a duty location. But in those cases, the pensions being denied. But in Eva Marie Bell, of course, fights a long battle with the Home Secretary, and she gets the pensions for the widows. Okay, now some of the war widows in 1971 we have prisoners of war who were taken 1971 war, 1965 war. In India, this problem persists, the problem of war widows, because we have so many women or widows who also don't know what happened to their husbands. And one such person is Damayanti Dambe, who's very interesting. She was at JNU. She used to be a sports director and herself a badminton champion. And she shared some of the details about her life with me, and I was very touched and moved. And so I took her permission to make a presentation about her life, about her. So she said she had not had the closure. Although the war had happened, the husband was gone, time had passed. So these are some of the ways in which one has to deal with. We are dealing with a very broad category of widows. All right. In conclusion, I would like to say that widowhood can be studied as a quest against social erasure. My effort here was to study it as a quest against social erasure and cultural invisibility. Such techniques can also help us understand other types of marginalizations in the society. My effort here has been to foreground the problem of erasure and go beyond the focus of domination and exploitation in gender studies. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to receive good questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atwal, for that wonderful lecture. And I think we, all of us, got to learn a lot from the conversation. Um, and I think I'll just check if we have some questions. So those who are watching us on YouTube can send us questions on the YouTube chat. Those who are on Zoom can either raise hand on Zoom.
Ishan, I can't hear you.
Uh, can others hear me on Zoom? Are you guys able to hear me? I'm not very sure.
Yes, sir, I hear you.
Uh, Ma'am, you have to, I think, increase the volume from of your computer, I think. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, now you're on. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. So I was saying that people who are watching us on YouTube can send their questions on the YouTube chat. Those who are on Zoom can either use the raise hand option on Zoom or send your questions in the Zoom chat. I'll be happy to read those out. I think there is one question. I can't pronounce the name. Sorry, but the question is: was a widow burning concentrated in one city or region, or was it nationwide thing? I
Was
think
it
it's about the
nation?
yeah, the practice of sati. Was it just confined in a region or a city, or was it a nationwide thing? I think that's the question.
Okay. Should I go ahead and answer that?
Yeah, yeah. I can see only one question right now, so yeah,
Okay.
you can ask.
All right. Um, well, it was actually not concentrated in one area, but we do have, but there are sporadic areas where there are pockets in India where they happen. We don't know since when, but 19th century is the first. In the 19th century, we have a systematic data collection, a systematic recording of the sati. And what happens is the good part is that they also record the caste of the sati, the age of the sati. So we have a lot of evidence. One can just work on these things. But we do have Bengal, of course, becomes very prominent when it comes to sati because of the numbers, sheer numbers. There are cases from other parts like the princely state Rajputana. There are, you know, other there are some cases from the south. There is, if not sati, there is of course widow burial, and so there is a sense that the most visual, the most brutal form is to actually see her burn. Uh, but then there are so many cases of child satis also which come up, and that is eventually what provokes the ban. How the ban is initiated, because it is the child. Now you can't expect a child to have any feeling about the husband, or feel very wifely or divine about the presence. It's just a child. Somebody who's 9 cannot have these feelings. Yeah, no, we do have, but Bengal tops the list. And also, you see, also the areas are clubbed together by
Yeah.
the time Sati is, like, for example, Northwestern province, um, uh, provinces are clubbed together with Bengal. And there are, you will find that areas like Mirzapur, Gorakhpur, these are all part of Bengal presidency. Bengal Bengal province, yeah, under the uh, under the governance of the same system. So the recording is made, and the recording goes very far off. There are
Hmm.
6 volumes of parliamentary papers on Sati. So obviously it all can't all be Bengal.
Yeah. Yeah. We have another question for you in the YouTube chat. It's by Brijesh Yadav. His question is: did Congress not pay attention towards women emancipation, especially widows, during the freedom struggle?
Emancipation of widows was a process which was set in motion in the 19th century, as I have articulated. But the political leadership at that point of time set about to train these women. Obviously, emancipation was a general idea. It was not specific to widows. And emancipation, not only in India but anywhere in the colonial, even in the West, If we look at the women's suffrage movement, they were in direct confrontation with the government, the British government, over the rights of the women to vote. It is after going to jail, after being in jail for so long, hunger striking, etc., after being forcefully fed in the jail, after all these stages, they arrived at the final destination, which was the voting rights were given to them. So any government, I don't think it's a question of encouraging or not encouraging, or it is a responsibility of some one government or two, or some government who came before or after. Gandhi, of course, if you're talking about Gandhi, yes, Gandhi, in a way, there are many views about it, but Gandhi also directed the women to address the independence, address movement towards unity and independence, two things which were very, very crucial at that point of time for any movement, be it home rule, be it quit India, be it non-cooperation. Unity was one thing. So if women were separating from men with their own agenda, how would they run the, so I cannot, I think it's a very complex question. It's a very complex situation. We don't have any answers to this, really.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that question, ma'am. I do not see any question right now on YouTube or on the Zoom chat, but as always, as I mentioned, those who have questions after watching, because our live audience is rather less always. So we were first would like to ask you to subscribe so that once we go live, you can watch it live. Watching live lectures are more fun than watching the recorded one. Of course, you can use those lectures later for your research or whatever purpose that you want to, but do watch our lectures live so that you can also get this opportunity to ask your questions directly to the speaker rather than emailing us, which is our second alternative. So you all can email us your questions at carvanheritage@gmail.com, which we always forward to the speaker and they can get back to you on email. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time today after your brief illness and after, we tried, we were thinking of a different theme, but then we thought we'll discuss widowhood, and the debates revolving around widowhood as we got to know about the reformers, the nationalists, the feminist perspectives. Now we also got to know about Gandhi's view of women emancipation, and how he kind of talked about the participation of women, all sorts of women, married, unmarried, single, widows, all sorts of women's participation in the freedom struggle, in the struggle for independence. But thank you so much, ma'am. It was truly an honor hosting you on Carvan, and I look
It
forward
was
to
a
hosting you again.
it was a real pleasure for me also, Ishan. It was great to be here. Although I'm sure this is the timing and everything. But since this lecture is going to be on the YouTube, and I hope there'll be some comments. And later on we'll keep checking. But
Sure.
thank you so much,
Yeah.
and you're doing a wonderful job of bringing
Thank you
people
so much, ma'am.
together. And
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much, ma'am. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on YouTube, on Zoom. And we have some more interesting conversations coming up on, I think, on 10th. Yeah, sorry, I keep forgetting because there are so many sessions lined up that I keep forgetting without seeing the calendar. But on 10th we have two amazing speakers with us for a panel discussion, Ritu Menon and Urvashi Butalia, to talk about the women experience of partition of 1947 of both sides of the border, India, Pakistan, and even Bangladesh, to a certain extent, because Bangladesh before 71 was part of Pakistan. So we'll talk about that. We also have Apurva Asrani joining us on Carvan in a day or two. We won't release the date because that's going to be a recorded session that we'll put up as part of our cinema archives. So Apurva Asrani is known for editing films like, legendary films like Satya. He was the film editor of Satya. and other films. He also recently edited a show called Made in Heaven. We also have Shama Zaidi, known for writing Garam Hawa, MS Sathu's most popular, or I think the most important historical cinema of India, Garam Hawa by MS Sathu. She was also the costume designer for Satyajit Ray's Shatranj Ke Khiladi, along with many other films. So we are going to host Shama Zaidi too on our cinema archives. We also have many more scholars coming up to deliver the Carvan's special lecture towards the end of the month. So do check that out. All the informations are posted on our social media handles, be it Facebook, be it YouTube, or be it Instagram. Our handle is at Carvan Heritage, KARWANHERITAGE. We also have a WhatsApp group, official WhatsApp group that you can join for more details if you are on WhatsApp. The link is in the description of this video. So do check that link, do join our WhatsApp group, do join the mailing list if you want to get notifications on your email. There's also the subscribe button, red button just in front of the channel name. Click on that. It doesn't cost anything, but it would help us to grow on YouTube, to spread the message of the importance of academic history in India today. With that thought, thank you so much, everybody. We'll meet again on 10th of July for our second, for our third